New Year's Eve, a night of celebration, laughter, and new beginnings. But for some, the night doesn't bring joy. Instead, it unravels into an experience so terrifying that it haunts them for years. These are not just stories, they are real accounts of people who encountered the unexplainable, the sinister, and the deeply unsettling. Brace yourself, because once you hear these stories, you may never look at New Year's Eve the same way again. New Year's Eve, a night of celebration, a night of warmth and laughter. For most people, it was a night to surround themselves with family, friends, and the promise of a fresh start. For me, it was the night that changed everything. It started with a flight delay. Not a huge deal at first, just an inconvenience. But that single delay set off a chain of events that left me alone, driving through miles of empty Ohio backroads with only my golden retriever Vera as my passenger. The snow had been light when I started driving, a faint dusting on the fields. But as the night deepened, the air felt heavier. The black sky stretched above me like a void, starless and cold. I turned on the radio. Static. I flipped through the stations. More static. No music. No voices. Just the hollow, empty sound of white noise. I shut it off, and that was when Vera started whining. At first I ignored her. She had always been a restless dog, and long car rides made her antsy. But then, she stood up. Her ears perked. Her breathing changed. She wasn't just restless. She was listening. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was irrational, but in that moment, I became aware of just how alone I was. The road behind me? Pitch black. The road ahead? Empty. Then Vera let out a low, uneasy whimper, a sound I had never heard from her before. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You okay, girl?" My voice felt too loud in the silence. She turned to look out the window. I followed her gaze, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, a shadow, deep in the tree line. But when I blinked, it was gone. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. I was just seeing things. That's what I told myself. But Vera wouldn't stop staring. About 20 minutes later, Vera started whining again, louder this time. I sighed. All right, you need a break?" She let out an urgent bark. I pulled over near a small clearing by the woods. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. The second I opened the door, the cold hit me like a punch. The air was sharp, bitter. Vera leaped out, sniffing the ground frantically. Her tail was stiff, her muscles tense. She wasn't just stretching her legs, she was on alert. I exhaled, watching my breath turn to mist. "Make it quick, girl." She wandered toward the tree line, sniffing cautiously. I rubbed my arms, glancing around. The woods stretched out before me, dark and impossibly still. And then, a loud crash from deep within the trees. Not just a branch snapping. Something big was moving. Vera froze. Then, she bolted. "Vera!" I barely had time to react before she disappeared into the darkness. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and ran in after her. The second I stepped past the tree line, the darkness devoured me. My flashlight barely cut through the void. The trees loomed high, their skeletal branches twisting like clawed fingers overhead. I called Vera's name again. Nothing. Then, rustling, somewhere ahead of me. I took a step forward, heart hammering. "Vera?" Another step. Then I heard it, breathing, slow, deep, close. I turned, and that was when I saw them. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But no. 3 figures, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, staring. I felt my stomach drop. My body screamed at me to run, but I was frozen. Then Vera appeared. She was crouched low, trembling. Blood matted her fur near her shoulder. She had been cut. Something, or someone, had hurt her. That was enough for me. I sprinted back to the car, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears. I threw the door open, shoved Vera inside, and jumped in after her. My hands shook violently as I jammed the keys into the ignition. I looked up. The figures were closer. Not running, not rushing, just closer. That was the final straw. I slammed my foot on the gas and tore out of there, my tires kicking up slush and gravel. I didn't stop. I didn't breathe. I just drove. It wasn't until I had put miles between myself and that clearing that I let myself look at Vera properly. Her wound was shallow but deliberate, a clean cut made by a blade. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting, and for the rest of my life, I will always wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't run? I didn't know how long. I had been driving. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the wheel, and my heart was still hammering in my chest like a war drum. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see them, those figures, standing in the middle of the road, staring after me. But there was nothing, just the empty blackness of the Ohio backroads stretching endlessly behind me. Vera whimpered beside me. I glanced over at her, my breath still uneven. The blood on her golden fur stood out like ink on paper. I needed to check her wound. I needed to stop and get my bearings. But every time I thought about pulling over, my mind screamed, no. I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not while the memory of those figures still clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake. I kept driving. Something was following me. After what felt like forever, I reached a small roadside gas station, the first sign of civilization I had seen in miles. I pulled into the lot, my tires crunching over gravel. The place looked almost abandoned, only a single flickering light above the entrance, casting a weak, yellowish glow. I turned off the car, exhaling shakily. For a moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Vera let out a soft whimper. Right. I had to check her wound. I reached back, grabbing my mom's first aid kit from the back seat. It took everything in me to step out of the car, the cold air immediately pressing against me, wrapping around me like an unwelcome presence. I carefully opened the passenger door, running a hand over Vera's fur. She winced as I touched the cut. It wasn't deep, but it was too clean, too precise. This wasn't an accident. Someone had cut her on purpose. I swallowed, trying to ignore the nausea twisting my stomach into knots. Who the hell had been out there? I turned my head slightly, my gaze flickering toward the woods behind the gas station. And then, I froze. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but no. There was something standing at the edge of the tree line, not moving, not coming closer, just standing there, watching. My entire body went cold. It was one of them, one of the figures from the woods. I couldn't make out any details. The gas station's weak light barely reached that far, but the shape, the posture, it was the same. I wasn't safe, even here, even after all the miles I had put between myself and that clearing. They had followed me. I yanked Vera back into the car, slammed the door, and locked it. My fingers fumbled for my phone, but my hands were still trembling too much to dial anything. Think. I turned my gaze toward the gas station itself. The inside was dimly lit, the glass windows streaked with grime. A single person stood behind the counter, a middle-aged man with a tired expression. He looked normal, safe. I could run inside. I could ask for help. But as soon as that thought crossed my mind, I noticed something. The man at the counter wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me. His eyes were wide. His face was pale, like he had just seen something impossible. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass door, and my blood ran cold. There was someone standing outside, a dark silhouette, standing just beyond the reach of the flickering light. Still, motionless, watching. I felt my entire body seize with terror. The man behind the counter backed away, his lips parting slightly, like he wanted to say something, but then suddenly, the power flickered. For a brief second, the entire gas station went dark, and when the lights came back on, the figure outside was gone. I didn't wait. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal and peeled out of the lot, my tires skidding over the gravel as I sped back onto the empty road. Vera let out a sharp bark beside me, but I couldn't focus on her. I was too busy checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone sitting in my back seat. But there was nothing. I drove as fast as I could. The road twisted and turned, my headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the snow-dusted asphalt. And then, up ahead, I saw it, a shape in the road, a person, standing dead center in my lane. I barely had time to react. My pulse skyrocketed, my hands jerking the wheel hard to the right. The tires screamed against the pavement as the car skidded, nearly spinning out of control. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding violently. For a second, I just sat there, gripping the wheel so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. Then, slowly, I turned my gaze back toward the road. No one was there, but I had seen them. I knew I had seen them. Vera let out a low growl beside me. She had seen them too. I never made it to my cousin's house that night. I ended up driving to a motel off the highway, too terrified to continue, down the back roads alone. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. The figures in the woods, the one outside the gas station, the person who had stood in the middle of the road. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. I still wonder what would have happened if I had stayed at that gas station a second longer, or if I had pulled over when I thought I saw someone in the road, or if I hadn't been fast enough, if Vera and I had been too slow. I don't drive through back roads anymore. I don't stop at gas stations in the middle of nowhere. And every New Year's Eve, as the clock strikes midnight, I can't help but feel like somewhere, deep in the Ohio woods, they're still watching me, waiting, for me to make a mistake, for me to come back, for me to be alone again. If this story sent chills down your spine, hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a good scare. New Year's Eve, a night meant for warmth, for countdowns and champagne. But that year for me, it was a night of isolation. I was on my way to my parents' house in upstate Pennsylvania, a simple drive that should have taken just a few hours. But the blizzard had other plans. At first, the snowfall was light, just flurries, swirling lazily under the glow of my headlights. I even thought it was beautiful. But as the minutes passed, the flakes grew heavier, denser. Soon they weren't dancing anymore. They were piling up. The road ahead blurred into nothingness. I switched on my high beams. A mistake. Instead of helping, the bright light reflected off the falling snow, turning my windshield into a swirling, impenetrable white abyss. My stomach twisted. I wasn't going anywhere. I pulled off to the shoulder, my hands tight on the wheel. The wind howled outside, rattling the car. I was completely alone, or so I thought. Minutes passed, then an hour. I had been turning the engine on and off to conserve fuel, shivering in the half-dark, watching the snow climb higher and higher around me. Then, headlights, cutting through the storm from behind me. Relief flooded through me. I had never been so happy to see another vehicle in my life. It was a snowplow, a massive, heavy-duty truck, its yellow hazard lights flashing through the whiteout. It pulled up beside me, the engine roaring, steam rising from the exhaust. A window rolled down. A man leaned out. He was older, late 50s, maybe early 60s. His face was weathered, lined with deep wrinkles, the kind that spoke of decades spent in brutal winters. He wore a thick dark coat, the hood pulled up over a black knit hat. His eyes were small and sunken, barely visible beneath the shadows of his hat. For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then he spoke. "You stuck?" His voice was deep, gravelly. Something about it sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the cold. I nodded, forcing a small laugh. "Yeah, my car can't handle this kind of snow." He was silent for a beat, then he nodded, like he had already known my answer. "You won't get far," he said, "especially not in that thing." I swallowed, glancing at my car. He wasn't wrong. "Need a lift?" he asked. I hesitated. The logical part of me screamed, "Don't get in, you don't know him." But the practical side won. I was stranded in a deadly blizzard. There were no other cars, no way to call AAA. My parents were miles away, probably already panicking, and the man looked normal enough. I nodded. "Yeah, that'd be great, thanks." I grabbed my bag, locked my car, and climbed into the passenger seat of the snowplow. The warmth hit me instantly, making my skin tingle from the temperature change. For the first few minutes, we drove in silence. The only sound was the heavy thunk-thunk of the plow scraping against the pavement, carving a path through the snow. I glanced at the GPS on my phone. The screen glowed dimly, the signal flickering in and out. I gave him directions to my parents' house. He nodded again. "Yeah, I know the area." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. We drove for maybe 10 minutes before I noticed something strange. We weren't heading in the right direction. I knew because the GPS was literally pointing the other way. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. Are we going the right way?" The man didn't look at me. His grip tightened on the wheel. "Back roads are better." My pulse quickened. "Better how?" He exhaled sharply through his nose, like my question annoyed him. "Highway's too risky in a storm like this." I glanced at the dashboard. The radio was off. Had it always been off? I looked down at his hands gripping the wheel. His knuckles were cracked and raw, as if he had been gripping something too tightly for too long. I forced a chuckle. I appreciate the help, but I think I'd rather take my chances on the highway. For the first time since I got in the truck, he turned his head to look at me, and he smiled. It was small, barely there, but it wasn't friendly. It was something else, something that made my stomach drop. I tried to keep calm. I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But then, I noticed other things. The empty liquor bottles rolling near his feet, the torn-up map stuffed into the door pocket, the knife wedged between the seats. My breath hitched. I turned back to the window, forcing myself to think. I needed to get out of the truck, fast. But how? Then I saw it. A house in the distance. The first one I had seen in miles. A lifeline. I waited until we got closer. Then, I moved. I threw open the door and jumped. The cold air hit me like a wall. I landed hard, my knee slamming into the ice. Pain flared through my leg, but I didn't stop. I ran. Behind me I heard the truck screech to a stop. I glanced back. He was fumbling in the glove box. A gun? A knife? I didn't wait to find out. I sprinted toward the house, my lungs burning. The porch light was on. That was good. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the door swung open. A man and woman stood there, wide-eyed with shock. They pulled me inside. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping. The couple called the police. By the time the cops arrived, the snowplow was gone. They searched, but in that storm, there was no way to track him down. The house owners helped me call for a tow truck. I never drove in a snowstorm again. And every winter, when the snow starts to fall, I think about that night. I think about the man in the snowplow, and I wonder, What would have happened if I hadn't jumped? The moment I stumbled into that house, everything became a blur. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my chest heaving like I had just run a marathon. The couple who had opened the door hovered over me, their faces tight with concern. "Jesus, kid," the man muttered. "What the hell happened to you?" I tried to answer, but I couldn't. My throat was raw. My body still hummed with adrenaline. Then, finally, I croaked out the words. "There was a man in a snowplow. He wasn't taking me home." The woman exchanged a look with her husband. The warmth of the house should have comforted me, but it didn't. The moment I crossed the threshold, my mind didn't stop racing. I kept expecting to hear the rumble of that snowplow engine outside. The police arrived within half an hour. By then, I had regained enough composure to tell them everything. The old man, the wrong turn, the way he had looked at me, like he was sizing me up, waiting for the right moment. The bottles on the floor, the knife between the seats, the fact that, when I jumped out, he had immediately reached for something. But by the time the cops started searching the area, the storm had covered his tracks. There was no way to tell where he had gone. No snowplow, no tire marks. It was like he had vanished into the blizzard. I eventually made it to my parents' house, shaken, but safe. They were frantic when they saw me. My mom kept asking why I hadn't answered my phone. My dad, normally a man of few words, pulled me into a tight hug. For a while, I didn't talk about it. I told them I got caught in the storm, that a friendly couple let me stay at their place for the night. I left out the part about the snowplow driver. Maybe I didn't want them to worry. Maybe I didn't want to relive it. Or maybe I didn't want to admit that part of me was still terrified he'd find me again, because I couldn't stop thinking about one thing. He knew where I was going. I had told him. And if he had followed me once, what was stopping him from doing it again? 2 days later, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but some sick, gnawing curiosity made me pick up. I brought the phone to my ear. "Hello?" Silence. I frowned. "Hello?" Then, a sound crackled through the speaker, a low, muffled breathing. I felt my stomach clench. "Who is this?" Still, no response, but just as I was about to hang up, a voice, deep, gravelly, unmistakable. "You should have stayed in the truck." Click. The line went dead. I dropped my phone. My hands started shaking so badly, I had to clench them into fists to stop them. That voice, it was him. How did he have my number? I hadn't given it to him. Hell, I hadn't even taken out my phone in the truck. Unless he had looked at it. At some point, when I wasn't paying attention, he had seen my screen, my notifications, my messages, and now, he knew how to find me. I stood up so fast my chair scraped against the floor. I ran to the window, yanking back the curtain. Outside, everything was covered in snow. The driveway, the trees, the road leading into the neighborhood. No tire tracks, no headlights, nothing. But that didn't mean he wasn't out there. I barely slept for weeks after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard his voice. "You should have stayed in the truck." I started triple-checking the locks on my doors. I stopped going outside after dark. And every night, I listened. For the rumble of an engine. For the sound of a snowplow crawling down my street. I told myself it was over. That it was just some sick game to him. That he just wanted to scare me. But some nights, when the wind howled outside, I could almost hear something beneath it. The deep, steady hum of an idling truck, waiting. The winter passed, then the next. And slowly, I started to let my guard down. I moved to a new city, a place where it never snowed. For a long time, I thought I was finally safe. Until the next New Year's Eve, I was out with friends, celebrating at a crowded downtown bar. The air was warm, filled with music and laughter. I hadn't thought about him in months. And then, I saw him, sitting at the bar, same black knit hat, same weathered face. I froze. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew he saw me. For a long moment, I just stared. Then finally, he turned his head, and he smiled. That same cold, unreadable smile. I felt my pulse slam against my ribs. My breath hitched. Then, slowly, he raised his glass in a mock toast. A silent message. I found you. I stumbled back, knocking into my friend. Hey, you okay? They asked. I whipped my head around. But he was gone. The bar stool was empty, like he had never been there at all. The never-ending nightmare that was 3 years ago. I don't know what's worse, that I saw him again, or that I don't know if I ever really escaped him. Because sometimes, on cold winter nights, I still hear the sound of a snowplow in the distance. And every year, when December 31st rolls around, I wait. I wait for him to show up again, to remind me that no matter how far I run, he can always find me. And the worst part? Deep down, I know that one day, he will. If this story terrified you, drop a comment below. Have you ever had an encounter you couldn't explain? Share your thoughts. New Year's Eve had never been about fireworks or parties for me. No drunken countdowns, no confetti raining down at midnight. For as long as I could remember, my New Year's tradition had been the same: ice fishing. It had started with my dad and his buddies when I was a kid. While everyone else celebrated indoors, we would drive deep into the frozen wilderness of northwestern Ontario, set up our gear on some isolated lake, and spend the night fishing under the stars. Even after my dad passed away and my brother moved to Chicago, I kept the tradition alive. It was more than just a way to honor my old man. It was a ritual, a part of who I was. That year, my two best friends, Nate and Trevor, were the only ones willing to join me. They were the kind of guys who belonged in the wild. Burly, thick-bearded, comfortable in the cold. The kind of men who could chop wood for hours without breaking a sweat, who knew how to gut a fish with their eyes closed. I trusted them. But that night, trust wouldn't be enough. The drive to the lake, Nate was driving his old truck, one built for rough terrain, with four-wheel drive and massive snow tires. We had loaded it up with everything we needed: rods and tip-ups, bait, a sled for hauling gear, a small pop-up shelter to block the wind. The forecast predicted a clear, cold night, but in Ontario, weather reports were never reliable. As we drove down the lonely, snow-covered road, excitement buzzed between us. "This place is going to be perfect," Trevor said, leaning forward from the back seat. "No crowds, no noise, just us and the lake." "That's the point," I grinned. "No distractions." Nate nodded, gripping the wheel. "Just like the old days." For the first time that week, I felt good, like we were exactly where we were meant to be. Then we saw him. The stranger by the trailhead. He was standing near the entrance to the lake trail, a lone figure, bundled in heavy winter gear, motionless in the falling snow. At first I assumed he was just another fisherman, but something felt off. He wasn't carrying any gear, no sled, no rods, just standing there, staring at our truck as we pulled up. I felt a faint unease creep into my gut. Then, slowly, he looked down at his phone, then back at us, then back at his phone again. I exchanged a glance with Nate. He noticed it too. Trevor frowned. "What's that guy's deal?" I forced a shrug. Maybe he's waiting for someone. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The desperate plea for help. We parked. The second we stepped out, the man came running toward us. His arms waved frantically, his breath coming out in desperate puffs of white mist. "Hey, please, you have to help me." I froze. Nate took a cautious step forward. "What's wrong?" "My buddy, he fell through the ice. He's still out there." The man held up his phone, his gloved fingers shaking. "He just called me. I need help." Trevor didn't hesitate. He was already moving. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But something felt wrong. His voice was desperate. But it wasn't panicked, like he was acting, like he was waiting for us to take the bait. But by the time my brain caught up, we were already following him into the trees. The man led us away from the usual fishing spots. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. My boots crunched against the snow. The distant sounds of the truck's engine faded behind us. Trevor was still charging ahead, determined to help, but something was wrong. We weren't heading toward the open lake. We were moving toward a secluded shoreline where the trees loomed higher, where the ice would be thinnest. I slowed down. "Hey man, where exactly did he fall?" The stranger didn't answer. He kept walking, faster now. Nate grabbed my arm, his voice low. "Something's not right." Then up ahead, they appeared. 2 more men, standing at the lake's edge, waiting. I barely had time to register what was happening before one of them raised a gun. "Stop right there." Time froze. A sick, paralyzing fear coiled in my stomach. The man who had led us here turned to face us, and for the first time, he smiled. We had been set up. Trevor stiffened beside me, Nate's hands clenched into fists. The second man spoke. "Keys, wallets, phones, now." None of us moved. "Now." The first man took a step closer. The gun in his hand didn't waver. Trevor's jaw tightened. "You're robbing us? Out here?" The man chuckled. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere." My heart hammered. This wasn't random. They had been waiting. For us. We had no choice. Nate reached into his pocket and tossed his truck keys. They landed in the snow. Trevor pulled out his wallet, his face red with rage. I wanted to fight. I wanted to do something, but these men were armed, and we were alone. They stripped us of everything, our phones, our wallets, even my dad's old fishing knife. One of them scoffed. "Seriously? Ice fishing on New Year's Eve?" My hands curled into fists. The third man picked up Nate's keys, tossing them to the gunman. He caught them without looking away from us. Then he smirked. "Thanks for the ride." And just like that, they were gone. We stood there, stunned, breath visible in the frigid air. Trevor swore, kicking at the snow. "Son of a..." Nate didn't say anything. He just stared at the ground, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. I exhaled shakily, trying to steady my thoughts. We had no phones, no vehicle, no weapons, and we were miles away from the nearest town. We were completely, utterly alone. And the worst part, as I looked back toward the road, I realized we had no idea if they were really gone. The 3 men were gone. But their absence did nothing to ease the weight pressing on my chest. We stood there, breath steaming in the freezing air, the realization slowly sinking in. No phones, no vehicle, no weapons, miles from the nearest town. Trevor let out a string of curses, pacing in the snow. Nate just stood there, fists clenched, his face unreadable. I turned back toward the road, half expecting to see headlights in the distance. But there was nothing, just the silent, endless wilderness. And then, I noticed something. The footprints. At first I thought they belonged to the 3 men who had robbed us. But the more I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. There were too many prints, some deep, fresh ones, belonging to us and the men, but underneath them, older tracks, leading into the woods, and not just human ones, something else, something big. A chill crawled up my spine. Guys, do you see this? Trevor stopped pacing. Nate finally looked up. Their eyes followed mine to the tracks. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Nate muttered, "What the hell made those?" The cold was setting in fast. Our only option was to walk back to town. It was at least 10 miles away, maybe more. None of us liked it, but freezing to death wasn't an option. So we started moving. The snow crunched beneath our boots as we followed the trail back toward the truck. The same road we had driven down so confidently just hours ago. Only now, every step felt wrong. The trees pressed in on either side, their branches hanging low and twisted. The wind had died down, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt unnatural. Trevor kept looking over his shoulder. He wasn't alone. I felt it too, like we were being watched. After an hour of walking, we spotted it. A cabin, small, isolated, the kind of place you wouldn't know existed unless you stumbled across it. A single light glowed inside. Trevor exhaled. Thank God. Maybe they've got a phone. Nate hesitated. Or maybe it belongs to those guys. The thought made my stomach twist. But at this point we were desperate. So we approached. I stepped up onto the porch, knocking once. No answer. Another knock. Still nothing. I turned the handle, unlocked. The second we stepped inside, the smell hit us. Rot. Like something had died and had been left there for days. Trevor gagged. Jesus, what is that? Nate flicked on his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside. That's when we saw it. The bodies. 2 of them. Slumped in chairs near the fireplace, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. My stomach lurched. Trevor backed away, his breath ragged. What the... Then we saw the carvings, etched into the wooden walls, symbols, patterns, and a message, carved in jagged letters. They watch from the trees. A wave of nausea rolled through me. I turned toward the window and my blood ran cold. Because in the darkness outside, something moved. I barely had time to process what I saw before Nate killed the flashlight. The cabin was plunged into darkness. He hissed, "Shut up. Don't move." Trevor swallowed hard. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" I wanted to answer, but I couldn't, because I heard it too. Footsteps, moving around the cabin, slow, deliberate, like something was circling us, something big, something that knew we were inside. My pulse roared in my ears. Nate motioned toward the back of the cabin. "There's a door. We can..." Bang. A loud, sudden knock at the front. We froze. Bang. Again. This time, harder. Trevor grabbed my arm. His grip was ice cold. What do we do?" Nate's voice was barely a whisper. "We don't answer it." I held my breath. For a long, excruciating moment, there was nothing. No more knocking. No footsteps. Just silence. Then, a single chilling sound. Scraping. Something dragging its nails down the cabin wall. And a voice. Low. Guttural. Wrong. It wasn't human. It whispered, "Come outside." We ran. Out the back door. Into the freezing dark. Branches whipped at my face as we tore through the trees, our breaths coming in ragged, panicked gasps. Behind us, something followed. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls were getting closer. Then, headlights. A car. On the road ahead. We burst from the trees, waving our arms. It skidded to a stop. The driver, a man in his 40s, jumped out, eyes wide. "What the hell? No time," Nate gasped. "Drive, now." To his credit, the guy didn't argue. We piled into the car, hearing it one last time, that inhuman whisper, "Next time." The unanswered questions. We made it to town. We called the police. They found the cabin. They found the bodies. But they never found the men who robbed us, or whatever had been outside that night. All I know is, we never went back, and I never went ice fishing again, because every year when New Year's Eve rolls around, I hear it, in the wind, a whisper, "Come outside." If this story sent chills down your spine, hit like and comment below. Would you have gone into the cabin?